The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Magi had departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophet might be fulfilled, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod had died, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." He rose, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go back there. And because he had been warned in a dream, he departed for the region of Galilee. He went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled: "He shall be called a Nazarene." The Gospel of the Lord. The body is made up of many, many cells, and to some extent, the health of the cells is reflected in the health of the body, and vice versa. To some extent, unhealthy cells make for an unhealthy body as well. In looking at the role of the family on this Feast of the Holy Family, it's like cells, families make up the health or the sickness, in some sense, of society and of the church too. The church back in Vatican II in 1965, some of the highest level of church teaching, says that the well-being of the individual person and of human and Christian society is intimately linked with the healthy condition of that community produced by marriage and family. So the idea is that the health and the well-being of human society, of our secular society, of our nation, of our world, and the health and the well-being of our Christian society, of our church, is linked to healthy families and to healthy marriages also. You can see that to some extent. The family is a little bit of a cell inside of our nation, and to some extent, each family then is also like its own nation or its own government. You have your own rules in your family, you have members of your family, you have leaders and followers in your family. You have peace and war from time to time, hopefully not too much war and a lot of peace in your own families. So that each family, in some sense, is a microcosm of society, of each nation to some extent. And the same is true when it comes to the family in the church. In fact, the Catholic Church calls a family a domestic church, meaning that what you do in this building is all fine, but this is the same thing that you're doing in your house, in your family, in your domestic church. You come here to worship and praise God. You do the same every day in your family. There are leaders of prayer in your families. You, in a sense, preach to one another. The kindness and the love you show to each other, your extended family here, it's exactly the same thing you do with your family members inside your own home. And so the health of our church and the health of our society, in some sense, is intimately linked to the health of marriages and the health of families too. The Diocese of San Bernardino, this past February 14th, recognized the importance to nurture and to cultivate family life and marriages. And so we have an initiative for the next 5 years of trying hard to focus on marriage preparation and of care of marriages and families even after the wedding celebration takes place in the church. Bishop Barnes writes, "Family is the basic unit of the church, where faith is transmitted. Realizing that the family relationships shape the directions of one's life more than all other experiences, and realizing that one's experience of God is directly related to one's experience of family, our parishes must be committed to nurturing and supporting family life." It's important that what you do inside of the family, it's important that we as a church, the leaders of the parishes, that we promote and strengthen and nurture your marriages and your family life. All those things are extremely important. And so, in the second reading today from Paul's letter to the Colossians, we hear some of the admonitions and some of the encouragement that St. Paul gives to relationships between spouses and the relationship between parents and children. And so St. Paul starts by saying, "Wives, be submissive to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness towards them." So the two ideas between spouses that St. Paul introduces, the idea of submission or subordination and the idea of being loving. And both of those are in contrast to being bitter or being harsh. It's one of the translations of Paul's letter to the Colossians. And so let me looking first at that idea of submission, looking at maybe more mutual submission, husbands and wives one to the other. Let me see what that is not. That doesn't mean not speaking up. It doesn't mean that you put up with any kind of abuse, that you let your spouse walk upon you in any way whatsoever. It doesn't mean that you have no opinion and that you're quiet all the time and never say anything. It doesn't mean not giving your ideas or giving your opinions to your spouse. It doesn't mean doing whatever your husband or your wife tells you to do all the time. It's not the same as obedience. Because later on in that same paragraph, Paul talks about children being obedient to their parents. So submission is not the same as obedience either. What is it? It's very much speaking your opinion. It's giving your desires to one another in a mutual manner. Both of you, each of you doing that, goes both ways. To some extent, it's you picking and choosing your battles with your spouse, right? What's important and what's not important. What do I stand up for here? What do I not stand up for? Again, realizing we all stand up for moral issues, but many of the battles between husbands and wives are not that important, right? Some of the things that turn into wars are battles that really should have ended a long, long time ago. Things that are extremely unimportant between husbands and wives. Submission is very much, it's a rational and a conscious choice on your part as a spouse to seek your spouse's well-being and happiness before you seek your own well-being and happiness. It's an attitude and a perspective and a mindset that I am here first to trying to please my spouse, him or her, whoever it may be. And then lastly, it's about my own well-being. Because love always seeks first the well-being of the other, and lastly, it seeks its own well-being. And so submission is one facet of love. St. Paul talks about for husbands saying, love your wives and avoid any bitterness towards them. There's every day of our life, every day is a great moment for love. Every day you wake up is a decision you make to love your spouse. Love is a lot harder than submission. Love is one aspect of submission, is one face in the sense of being submissive or subordinate. Love is a lot harder than to be submissive. We can be submissive to terrorist regimes and all kinds of other things too without loving them. Love is far more difficult. Love cuts both ways too, right? Love isn't just for husbands towards wives, it's for wives towards husbands as well. It goes both ways. And so again, the idea that in love, you seek your spouse's well-being and happiness before you seek your own, that you submit out of a sense of love, not out of fear, not out of obedience. And the opposite for St. Paul in his letter to the Colossians is bitterness or harshness. That is meanness. And sometimes there is meanness between spouses, unfortunately. Sometimes it's mean words that you have, cutting remarks. Sometimes you whisper something under your breath. Sometimes you give your spouse the silent treatment when you're not happy. Sometimes you seek ways to punish your spouse, which spouses should never do. You might punish your kids, but your spouse is not your child. And so sometimes, unfortunately, there's meanness that goes on between husbands and wives. That's the opposite of the love that should always be there between husbands and wives. And so for St. Paul, one of the ways the relationship of spouses is characterized in a Christian marriage is with some mutual submission and mutual love. And that's the example that you set for your children. St. Paul then talks about the relationship between parents and children. He tells children to be obedient to their parents in all things. I think as children get older, let's say the late teenage years, 17, 18, 19, young adult years, it's good for children to raise their voices, to raise their opinion. I always encourage teens and young adults to talk back to their parents, but it's all about how you talk back. It's always good to have communication with your parents. It's good that you give them your thoughts, your opinions, your feelings, your desires. It's good you do all those things, but it's the way you do it. Because when we say I was talking back, what we usually mean is I was yelling, I wasn't listening, I was disobedient, I was rude and disrespectful to my parents. That's never okay. It's okay to talk back when you speak calmly, when you speak rationally, when you speak honestly, when you don't raise your voice, when you're always respectful to your parents, and when in the end you always obey no matter what, even if you disagree. That's the way that you talk back to parents. But you always have to do so honestly. You don't tell lies. Oh, but Dad, you said 10:30 I can come back. No, actually, you knew it was 10. You have to talk rationally. You have to be reasonable in what you say. Don't say things that are foolish or just not true. And so it's the way that it's done, the interaction between parents and kids. And again, more so for older teens and also for young adults. Obedience to parents has always been likened in some sense to obedience to God. And that puts a little bit of onus on the children to obey parents. And again, we're talking about non-abusive situations, right? The best situations. But it also puts a big burden on parents. If children are supposed to be obedient to you like they are to God, what kind of responsibility do you have for what you tell them to do, right? You just don't tell them to do whimsical things just for your own happiness and pleasure. You tell them to do what's right. And so there's a huge responsibility on parents in seeking to have your children to be obedient to you. But children need to be obedient to parents in all things. Even if in the meantime, you're talking and discussing with your parents why this is the case and why you disagree and why you don't understand this. In the end, you're respectful and obedient. St. Paul says that in the relationship between parents and children, he says, parents, do not nag your children or do not provoke your children, is one of the translations. And so that doesn't mean there aren't rules in the family. It doesn't mean that there aren't punishments, consequences to disobedient actions on the part of your children. There should be all of that in a family, especially when the children are younger. But nagging and the provoking is kind of repeating something over and over and over again. And I know as parents, when the kids are especially younger, you need to do that, right? Nothing would get done if you didn't repeat yourself over and over and over again, right? Homework wouldn't get done. They wouldn't get out of bed for school. The room wouldn't be clean if you didn't say it 10 or 12 times. But again, and as much as nagging might be difficult for children to hear, if they obeyed the first time, can you imagine a world with no nagging? Can you imagine a world with children obeyed the first time you told them something, whatever it might be? I don't know what that would look like. Usually it's focused on TV and video games. You have to tell them 5 times to get their attention, another 5 times to get them away from those kinds of things. Imagine a world when children obeyed the first time. And I'm thinking of my own family, which wasn't like that either, of me being a child as well. And so St. Paul cautions parents not to nag their children, not to provoke them. Again, you might do that when they're a lot younger, but the other side of that coin is children being obedient to parents. I think there's also an issue for parents who nag their older children, their children who are 20, 30, 40, or 50 years old, because there's nagging that goes on that way too. I told you never to marry her. I told you that she wouldn't be good for you. I keep telling you to come back to church. When are you get married in church? When are you going to baptize your kids? It's like, okay, enough, Mom and Dad. I heard you the first time. I understand, and I might disagree with you completely. Adult children can make their own bad choices, and as much as it breaks the hearts of parents, there's nothing you can do about that. Because they're adults, and your adult children can make their bad choices to not follow God, to not raise the kids in any kind of faith, or to go off in a bad direction. There's nothing you can do about that as parents, as much as it breaks your heart. All you can do is pray for them, you commend them to God, you've told them once already, or 100 times, but at least once, just once, about what you think is what's best for them, and then you just let it go. Then you give them a good example, you love them to the very end, you love them all the time, and you let them work things out with their God. But I think sometimes the nagging of parents takes place more when the children are a lot older. St. Paul gives us some good advice for holy families, for us to grow in holiness and to work out being saints in the midst of our own families. And so, like in society as a whole and like the church as a whole, the family functions well if each person does his or her own part in the midst of the family. So on this Feast of the Holy Family, we look for good relationships between spouses, good relationships among parents and children as well. Pope John Paul II in 1984, speaking to the Pontifical Council for the Family, so there's a whole section of the Vatican dedicated to family life, In 1984, Pope John Paul II reminds us and encourages us in the importance of family life, saying, "The future of humanity passes through the family."